Hey friends, my name is Spencer French. I am a 2019 graduate from Bethel College, not Bethel University, with a degree in philosophy and a degree in Christian ministries and a minor in English. Now you might be asking, why did those degrees? And why is English just tacked on at the very end? Well, the answer is because I fell in love with it so deeply, but kind of late, and so that's neither here nor there though. And currently I'm at Yale Divinity School, and I'm getting a Master of Arts in Religion in Literature. So I'm pursuing the intersection of theology and writing and poetry and seeing how they can overlap in beautiful ways. And when Jen asked me to come in and speak to you guys about the creative process and different things that are helpful for writing and that's helpful for my process, I was really honored by it. And so today I'm just going to be leaning into these conversations and sharing some basic thoughts, and with the hope that while what I'm saying isn't scripture truth at all, that it may inspire something in your own life, in your own writing, that you can then take and develop. So without further ado, let's begin with a poem. This is the poem called These Poems, She Said, by the Canadian poet Robert Bringhurst. These poems, she said, are poems with no love in them. These are the poems of a man who would leave his wife and child because they made noise in his study. These are the poems of a man who would murder his mother to claim the inheritance. These are the poems of a man like Plato, she said, meaning something I did not comprehend, but which nevertheless offended me. These are the poems of a man who would rather sleep with himself than with women, she said. These are the poems of a man with eyes like a drawn knife, hands like a pickpocket's hands, woven of water and logic and hunger with no strand of love in them. These poems are as heartless as birdsong, as unmeant as elm leaves, which if they love, love only the wide blue sky and the air and the idea of elm leaves. Self-love is an ending, she said, not a beginning. Love means love of the things sung, not of the song or the singing. These poems, she said. You are, he said, beautiful. That is not love, she said, rightly. I find this poem to be just astounding in so many different ways, but particularly how it critiques and and properly contextualizes the creative task. Self-love is an ending, she said, not a beginning. Love means love of the things sung, not of the song or the singing. Love means love of the thing sung. Friends, that's the first poem in his collection, his collected works. And pretty much what he's saying is do not mistake love for poetry. There may be some overlap, but just because I sing about love does not mean that I'm loving. He's trying to contextualize his writing and offer healthy self-critique. And I think we need to consider this as we move forward. And so I want to give a brief sketch of the lecture, and then I'm going to dive right in, all right? So first, I'm going to talk about some big questions. I'm just going to ask the big questions about writing that I really hope you consider and lean into. Second, I'm going to talk through my own writing journey, and then ask, kind of with the hope that my own story can help elucidate some other things that maybe have shown up in your own life. Three, I'm going to close with talk of writing and psychology, the act of writing itself, and what we can learn from psychology about how to assist that. Now, in the second section, I will talk briefly about some of the poems I sent you, but we're not going to be able to go into those in much depth because I'm looking at my laptop right now and it says I'm taking up already quite a few megabytes, so I'm not even sure if I'm going to get through this lecture. We're going to see what's happening. All right? So, first, the big questions. Before we begin writing, it's important to ask, why? Now, of course, I'm not here to insult your intelligence. I'm sure all of you have thought about this once or again. I'm not acting like you haven't. But I think it's important to reflect upon regularly. Why is it that you write? Do you write purely for yourself? To help with self-discovery? Great. That influences then how you write. If you're only writing for yourself, then you really don't have to. There's no implied need for you to listen to other people about your writing. You can just do your own thing, and that's fine. Now, if you want to become a better writer, that makes sense. You can include other things. But if your only reason is your writing is for yourself, that influences then how you write and what you write about. Maybe you write because you see injustice in the world, and an incredible way of fighting that injustice is imagining a different world or critiquing that world through creative writing, through fiction, through poetry, through memoir. Wonderful option. Maybe it's because you just need to get a good grade in this class, and you like the professors in the English department, and that's it. I hope you find a reason deeper than that, but you have a pretty good discernment of the process. Jen's an incredible teacher, and you should be honored to have her as the teacher. So again, I hope you consider, if only for a few minutes, why do you write? Second, and it's related, for whom do you write? Now, if you're only writing for yourself, you don't really need to consider anything else. But if you're writing for specific audiences, if you're writing for specific contexts, it changes how you write. When you write young adult novels, it changes the kind of words you can use in the novel, right? If you're writing a philosophy textbook, you're going to be using very different language than if you're writing a young adult novel. And both are fine. But if you don't know your audience, then you're not going to know how to write. So again, another thing to consider is who you're writing for. If you're writing for as wide an audience as possible, well, then you should probably use pretty accessible words. Now, and that's fine if that's what you choose. The only concern with that is if you're stifling your creativity and stifling the uniqueness of the language you're using because you're trying to appeal to the masses, that kind of raises some questions about the nature of your creative process. If you're okay with that's fine, but just something to consider. An example of this from my life is I will write poems for churches sometimes. Sometimes they'll come bring me in, pay me to write and perform a poem for them. And when I'm in those contexts, it changes what I write about and how I write it. If I am only delivering a poem vocally, as opposed to on a page, that changes how I write. Now, hopefully there's some continuity between the whole thing. But ultimately, I care that people hear me. I care that people understand that I'm speaking to everyone. And as an act of creative humility and creative integrity, my audience does, in some certain ways, dictate what I write and how I write. Not entirely, but it's important to note, for whom do you write? Next, what do you hope to get out of your writing? As a consequence of your writing, what do you hope happens? Do you hope that someone pats you on the back and says, that's really great? If so, fine. I would ask, is there something a little deeper than that? If you hope someone encounters something transcendent in your work, I like that one, that's cool. Great, what does that look like? Setting healthy standards and boundaries will actually help you write better because you can stop worrying about things that may have been sitting in the back of your mind that you didn't even realize. What do you hope to get out of your writing? Do you hope that someone else walks away and says, wow, I thought I was alone in this. Wow, I was crying. Wow, you gave me the language I needed to grieve, to grow, to learn from that terrible experience. What do you hope to get out of your writing? It's a really important question to ask. Lastly, what do you write and why? Now again, we already asked the why question above, but your why question dictates then what you write. If you are interested in plumbing your own experiences, diving deeply so you can reconcile them with yourself, and also hope by telling stories, help others who are going through similar experiences, or help bring out truths about reality through that experience, memoir is the way for you. Creative essays are the way for you. If you have a specific little moment that moved you, and while it didn't really matter the broad context wherein that thing happened, but you have this moment, and that's so beautiful and transcendent that you're really, really trying to get language for it. It was so beyond words. Well then, guess what? It's likely that poetry is for you. Similarly, if you're a certain kind of aspect of reality that you want to evaluate or that bothers you, but you haven't seen it directly or your imagination takes you another place, well then start considering fiction and how fiction can be a lead into some of these deeper, bigger things. What you write is influenced heavily by why you write and for whom you write. And so again, like I know this class, in this class, you're considering different specific ways of writing, and there's not really one focus more than others. But again, you should be asking yourself, what do you write? What are you good at? What do you enjoy, and why? And so these are the questions I hope you consider as you listen to the rest of this lecture and as you go from here. Why do you write? For whom do you write? What do you hope to get out of your writing? And what do you write? These 4 questions I think are really essential for basing your confidence in your writing before you go and write. Now let's turn to my own writing life. Now again, I'm not sharing this because my experience is normative. God forbid we have another white straight guy try to act like his experience is normative for everybody, right? But I think it is helpful to hear someone else's experience and use it as a kind of a wall against which you form your own reality. Like, oh yeah, I resonate with that, that's pretty cool. Or, oh no, I resist that completely, I don't like that at all. And so I hope you take this story and run with it and use it. I really don't care about you hearing my story, I care about you using this to form your own. So I hope that ends up being what happens. So where did I begin writing? Well, I was a junior at high school, and it was the summer after my junior year, and I was working construction, and I'm just terrible at construction. I've never worked again, I guess not good. But the person I was working for, he was pretty macho guy, really cool. I mean, he worked construction, right? And he one day he just rolled up to me and read a poem and wept in the middle of it. And there was something beautiful and powerful and transcendent in that moment that sparked something inside me that's never quite left. I went home immediately and wrote a poem. I sent you the poem. It's called Will a Real Christian Stand Up? We're gonna get there later. We're gonna get to all that mess later. But that's what the poem was. That was the very, very first poem I ever wrote. And while I knew things weren't perfect, I knew things weren't really all right, I kept writing. I kept finding myself staying up late at night, writing things down, writing lines, writing different things. It's this really fascinating process. And again, it's stuck with me ever since. And so I started investing more into it. If you want to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. And so I started reading. I read Billy Collins and Mary Oliver. And growing up, I thought poetry had to rhyme. And so when I read Mary Oliver's work, I got really angry because this isn't poetry. Poetry needs a meter. Poetry needs rhyme, right? No, I don't really care about the trees or the birds or whatever unless the bird or the tree has a herd or a ski with which it's attached to, right? It was everything for me. And so, but by reading other things and leaning into these books, I was able to grow as a writer. Just a little tip on that. Poetry is super hard, and literature in general is pretty hard. And so if you find a writer, if you find a poet, if you find who resonates with you, who you understand, don't feel the need to skip over that to go find someone else who's harder. Let that person teach you for a while before you move on. I promise it'll be worth it. And so that happened, right? So I started finding these authors and really diving into these collected works and growing. And I started writing poems in the voices of the authors that I was reading as kind of a creative technique. Ooh, this will be interesting. I'm gonna try to see if I can sound like this person as I find my own voice. And this continued and continued and continued. Now, it was just a hobby, right? I would do my homework a little bit early so I could have some time to write poetry at the end. But as I realized I was doing this, it made sense then to start taking classes. So I took multiple classes in creative writing and poetry with Jen. I took, I think 4 actually, like an impressive amount. And I just had to write. And so I began taking more and more and more time and focus towards it. Now, as I did that, my life changed pretty substantially. I realized that I was gaining depth as a person. I realized that I was interacting with the world differently. As I look out the window right now, it just started snowing. And there's just some kind of meaning and some kind of experience I have, even if just the snow right outside right now, that wasn't the case when I was a kid. Wasn't the case in the small farm town where I began writing. In fact, when I told my parents I started to write poetry, they were really concerned. I could be gay. I could be depressed or worse, gay, right? Like, oh no, we can't have that. Like, it was really bizarre actually, but whatever. But this writing began like forming my life and forming my eyes and the way I interacted with the world. Stars became more important, more beautiful. The sunset became more important, more beautiful. And I'm not trying to paint this picture of me frolicking around and with my pen and my pencil, just like writing things like crazy. My pencil, my note paper. Like, I'm not saying that. But from that day on, if you were to look at the margins of my journals, of my notebooks, you'd find me rhyming words, of sounding out how this sounds like this or conflicts, dissonance, and I would obsess over words. Like, I could literally taste them in my mouth. I could taste how a certain word feels. And it changed how I write. And so I just kept investing in that. But again, it was kind of a hobby. It was a minor. It wasn't a major. It was a minor, right? And then I went to graduate school, and I realized that these like abstract concepts in theology and other things that I've liked studying for such a long time don't hold the same interest that poetry does. That I want to actually engage with these really complex issues in the form of poetry, not over and against it. I don't want to just, analyze. I want to engage. I want to create. And so I changed my degree, and I'm focusing now on that. So I asked earlier big questions about what writing means. And again, I'm writing from the perspective of a poet. I think this applies to other things because I also will write essays and I do write some fiction, but I focus primarily on poetry. So I'm speaking as a poet, but I hope you can take this if you're a memoir writer or what have you. So what does poetry mean for me? Why do I write poetry? Well, I write poetry because I have these experiences of the world that I don't have words for, that are so deep and so important that I really struggle to make sense of them at all. Even little moments of beauty, even moments of myself, I'm inexplicable to myself in many ways. And so I turn to writing to try to engage with that, to wrestle with the mysteries of reality. And hopefully, so other people can help in their processes too. I don't just write for myself, I write for others. But I write beginning with myself because I'm really curious about how this world works. And the world is really hard. Reality is really hard. And we need good critical thinkers who are courageous to lean into those questions and to see what's really there. Again, I think poetry and creative writing, fiction, memoir, whatever, is able to engage with big abstract questions in ways that philosophy and theology will never be. Because those are embodied practices. You can reduce things down to syllogisms or whatever else in philosophy, but you don't actually see how that applies and affects the real world unless you take that and make it and think it through in the real world on your own. This is what I'm interested in poetry. This is what I'm interested in writing, is giving language to these remarkably complex experiences. For whom do I write? I write mostly for myself. But again, I write for people who are like me. And what I mean like me, I mean really curious and struggling. I was clinically depressed for 3 years at Bethel. And I say that because there's a lot of students who are, especially in writing classes, just being honest. And we don't talk about that enough. So yeah, that's been my experience. And I was trying to process through this, but I didn't have the words for it. And so I write for other people who are seeking like me. You could be different gender, you could be different race, you could be different things, but that's not as important to me, though that is very important. We need to acknowledge those different categories, and that makes us different. But I write for people who are interested in searching out these big questions. So that's for whom I write. And what do I hope to get out of writing? There's no joy in writing beyond reading a poem to someone and saying, wow, that helped. I don't really know how or why, but that helped. And so that's why I write. I write to get better language, and I hope I give people better languages and better images for encountering reality. And we'll see that when we turn to my writing, hopefully. And lastly, what do I write? Well, I write poetry. Why? Because because a lot of my life is filled with these moments of incredible grief or incredible joy or both at the same time. And it is those small moments that I'm trying to re-communicate in slightly different ways in my poetry. And so there's also other things like fiction or short stories that are more conducive to other projects I have in mind. So those are also going on too, but I find myself more directly drawn to poetry because poetry is most given towards forming new language for these experiences. So that's that. And as I finish this section, now I'm going to turn to the 4 poems I sent you, and I'm going to just talk really briefly about each, okay? So the first one I want to talk about is 2 haikus in each season. Why did I send you this poem? Why did I write it? What's going on there? I think this poem is absolutely not finished. It needs some work. And the reason why it needs some work is because it has no really strong emotional guidance within. It's pretty like, here's an experience, and here's an experience, and here's an experience, and here's an experience, and they're kind of all mashed together. Now, that's not super uncommon for haikus. I actually have a book of haikus right here. This is the collected haikus of Yosabu-san. Incredible. I'd really recommend it. Also, the collected haikus of Basho. Really remarkable stuff. I mean, in a haikus, like, you're trying to embody, you're trying to capture the beauty of a moment in 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables. This tiny little stanza. And it's a really hard thing to do. It makes you write with great brevity and intensity. But I wrote these because there's these different experiences that happen in different seasons. Also, it's a really important haiku tradition is writing for the seasons. But there's this really important and powerful thing about attaching emotions and attaching experiences to these little vignettes of what you see. And I was really happy with how they turned out, though I think they need to be ordered and changed a little bit to make more coherent sense. My favorite is the last one, which if you paid close attention, actually finishes on 6 beats, not 5. Whoops. But it goes like this. My pipe smoke rises in winter air like prayer, fogging the silent moon. In this little poem right there, you're able to encounter the solitariness that most people walk with, the solitude that follows you, that follows me at least, and that there's this other being, God, that I believe in, but that is quiet. And of course, now you guys, should be careful about this poem because I talk about smoking my pipe, and that's obviously against Bethel's rules, so I'm not condoning that in any way. But I think, again, it's a really interesting image, is pipe smoke rising like prayer, and looking up, and there's a fogging of the silent moon. At the same time, it talks about incredible aloneness. I understand that's not a word. I'm going to use it anyways. I'm a poet. Incredible aloneness, and at the same time, this solitude, there's this serenity to the aloneness. It's a very complex picture, and that complexity is exactly what I'm interested in. The next poem is Le Café de Nuit, and it's a painting that's actually at Yale Art Museum, and it's free to go in there. So one day I just grabbed a chair, went to the only Van Gogh in the place, put my chair down, and just stood there for about 4 hours and just looked at the painting. And again, I'm trying in this poem to embody the painting itself in the words I'm using. So if you read it, it's kind of wild. Like, the language I'm using is bizarre. After midnight, cordal lamp-like, wax-like, glares from gas lanterns hung as frost pears. The rhyme in there should be cloying. The rhyme in there should be should be way too much. Because we're looking at a cafe where people are getting drunk or trying to buy I'm, to be honest, trying to buy prostitutes and the complexity and like the difficulty of that system. And this is what's going on. And in order to communicate that, I'm using language that is really cloying. It's way too much. And that's exactly why I wrote it that way. And it closes with this very interesting picture, right? In Van Gogh, if you look at the painting, right in the back of the painting, there are these pink flowers, which are just so out of place, it's not even funny. And it has to be hope. Everything else is gross and disgusting, and again, cloying is really the word there. And right in the back, there's a pair of flowers that are there's a cluster of flowers that are looking out over the entire cafe. And I say that they look out there with what a maudlin man would call concern. So and they look out on the cafe's slow burn with what a maudlin man would call concern. The speaker of the poem looks at this place of depravity, looks at this place of brokenness, and sees that there should be hope there. Sees that there's hope there with the flowers, but cannot bring himself to acknowledge it. Maudlin, he's drunken, he's foolish, he's feeling sentimental, it's not real. And yet the flowers are still there. The next poem I want to talk about is the very first poem I wrote, and I'm only going to give this like a minute. Will the Real Christian Stand Up? I am only including this because I want you to see growth in the writing process. All right, my first 30, 40, 50 poems were all like this one. Super long, super wordy, really rhyme, and just very cheap. They didn't really lean into some of the complexities of reality. Also, I'm pretty sure this poem is like a little patriarchal as well. I was a junior in high school when I was talking about like women's, leaving their body, whatever. Like, I'm sorry about that. I've grown up. And so I appreciate any grace that's read with that. I hope you laughed at it, quite honestly. But I sent that kind of as an act of humility as well. It's really easy to walk in here and, throw around some big name at some school that I'm at. But writing has always been a journey. And I hope that you're able to be gentle with yourself after seeing that. There is such a thing as growth. Now, this last poem that I want to talk about is actually, I'm going to read it to you real quick. It's A Summer in Alaska. It's really a favorite. I think it's really astounding in some ways. So I'm going to read it to you real quick, talk about it briefly, and then we're going to turn to writing and psychology. The Summer in Alaska. You are Sicilian. 100% in fact. That was the first thing you ever told me. Though also about 20% Irish and maybe sometimes a little Scottish too. You had an endearingly lazy eye, plain brown, the skin around nearly swollen shut, like an oyster trying unsuccessfully to hide a pearl of great price. Your name isn't Sicilian, you confess, so your friends sometimes make fun of you. But I'm sure this was just jest, common practice in that community of purebred island of Italy kids. At that moment, I quietly prayed that they would never uncover your idiot Irish ancestry nor scanty Scottishness. They're all in California now, where you live. You spend the summer in Alaska, in the care of strangers. Your dad did some bad things to you sometimes. You cannot be any older than 9. You think it's a sad situation sometimes. You don't want to talk about it anymore. I oblige. You look like the Christ of old icons. Cross-eyed. I stare into the sometimes Sicilian slant in your gaze. I shook your hand, and you went and played. I just feel like this poem is really powerful, to me anyways, because of the passion, of the emotional energy that's captured so quickly. It begins with this kind of playful banter. And if you're reading closely, you see ominously the eyes swollen shut. Maybe it's a birthmark, but probably not. And so I'm the speaker of the poem, which in this case is actually me. So I'm using this really playful language, 25% Irish and Scottish. And so it's very funny and clever and whatever else. But as you go along, something should feel off. And then after that big parenthetical about prayer right in the middle, the whole bottom falls out of the poem. My dad did some bad things to me. She says, my dad did some bad things to me sometimes. And I don't know about you, but I've had plenty of really random conversations where people just open up. I mean, this girl was 9 years old. Open up and just say something that just levels you. And this poem is not trying to speak, like, if you were to boil down this poem to be, oh, it's about abuse, or it's about this or that, they would say, no, it's not. It's more than that. There's more going on here. But quite frankly, I don't know entirely what it's about. All I know is I met this wonderful girl, and she was going back to California at the end of summer. I was in Fairbanks when this happened. And the only thing I could do in response to that was to write. A couple of things to note about this real quick. If you look at the last 5 or 6 lines of this poem, you'll notice that all of them are slant rhymes. 9, sometimes, oblige, I'd, gaze, played. All of those are slant rhymes. They're almost pure rhymes, but they're not, like light and night. There's always something a little off. And I'm doing that, first of all, because this should end in dissonance. And also to point out, to connect with her having a slanted eye, which most likely came from being abused. Lastly, there's the line, you look like the Christ of old icons, cross-eyed. If you look at the oldest icon we know, one of Christ's eyes looking forward and the other is looking to the side like this to demonstrate the 2 natures of Christ, all God and all man. And I've just found it to be really moving. Similarly, Christ was cross-eyed in the Gospel of Luke. Half the book is him walking to Jerusalem, walking towards the cross. And so by no means am I trying to celebrate or magnify suffering prescriptively. Like, it'd be good if you did this. But I have no control in this situation. But descriptively, with the theology that I hold, I believe that this girl is going to a situation where likely things aren't going to be good. And in so doing, as difficult it is even to say, Christ is walking alongside her in that. That's what I'm trying to get at in this poem. I think it's a really good example. I really like this poem. I don't feel uncomfortable saying I think it's a good poem. I think it's a really good example of how the formal decisions we make can really influence how we read poetry. Those slant rhymes at the end of this poem are everything. The use of the sometimes as it sets up towards the bottom. Formal decisions mean a lot. They're very important. And the things you should consider very seriously as you write. All right. So now let's turn to the writing process. We are in the home stretch. We've probably got about 15 minutes left. I'm assuming that most of you, maybe not all, but most of you have at some point in your life felt inadequate as you write. I sure have. I feel like I didn't have the tools. I wasn't smart enough, wasn't good enough to do the very things that good writers do. And to all of you who feel that way, I just want to remind you that if they took a supercomputer and attached it to another supercomputer and attached it to another one, they attached it to all the most unique, impressive artificial intelligence, all the smartest things, all the best research, and strapped them all together, they would not have a mind as complex and as wonderful as yours. The mind, your mind, the one that you walk around with, is the most complex and wonderful thing in the entire universe. There is not a thing that we've found that's more complex than that. Now, again, I want to be careful here, right? The mind can be a tyrant sometimes. And again, I've struggled with mental illness, so I understand that fully. But as we go for the writing process, you must remember in the moments where you hit writer's block, in the moments where you don't feel adequate, that you, by choosing it or not, you have a mind, which means you have the capacity for incredible creativity. Remember that. Remember that. Now let's talk about some of that creativity. How many of you have been walking or talking with someone and a word comes into your mind, almost a word, like the remnants of a word? If LaCroix was a word, right? Like the drink, you know what I'm saying? That is like only slightly flavored. Like you know that there's a word for the thing that you have, but you don't know the word. Just a remnant of it. And you're like, oh, damn, what's that word? Oh, sorry for Bethel people. Dang, what's that word? Like I can't find it. And then you drop it. And then 8 hours later, you're walking and it's like, oh, the word was serendipitous. You didn't actively choose to remember it. Something was going on where you remembered it later. Something was going on in your mind that you weren't conscious of, you weren't cognizant of, but nevertheless was going on. That was your subconscious. Your subconscious was working on something as you were going around your day. Your mind is that complex. There is unconscious creativity. One of the best things I could say about writing projects is procrastinate. Oh, it's really helpful. Come up with an idea. If you get stuck, put it down. Put it down and go do something else. Find another, like stay focused, right? But just put it down. Go for a run. Come back. Your subconscious mind is your greatest friend in creativity. Give it space to do its work. It will work for you if you let it. And I think this can come by creating rhythms, which we're going to talk about just in a moment, but I want to talk about another concept. And the other concept is the concept of flow. Now, it's by the famous Hungarian psychologist, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. That's how you say it, that spell his name. It's Csikszentmihalyi. It took like 30 minutes on YouTube to figure out how to say it. And he is writing in this book about optimal experience. Now, he's trying to write a whole entire worldview thing. He's trying to write about how, how his concept of flow can change your entire life and everything else. And I think it might be a little overstated. But in creativity, it's really powerful. How many of you have had an experience where you started doing something and you just went timeless? You could be playing sports, you could be writing, whatever else. And you realize that you've been doing this thing for like 4 or 5 hours. That is a space where incredible creativity happens. And it happens when you have the right amount of skill with the right amount of challenge. If you have too much skill, this is right from Mihai's work, if you have too much skill and not enough challenge, you're gonna be bored. If you have too much challenge and not enough skill, you're gonna be anxious all the time. But if you have a right balance of both, you can grow and continue to get better. And as you continue to get better, you can then up the challenge to make things even harder to continue to grow. But that's how that works. And so a question becomes, as a writer, how can I use my subconscious? How can I use the tendency of minds to really get absorbed into really good work? How can I do that? How can I make my body form rhythms that do that for writing? Well, there are different ways to do this, I'm sure. I'm going to share what's been helpful for me. 2 things. 1, creating rhythms. Writing rhythms. I will write on this day, from this time to this time, regardless of how I'm feeling. And trying to practice awareness of what I'm writing. So here's what I mean by that. Every single Friday morning, from 8 o'clock to 11:30, I'm writing. I'm writing poetry. And I take that and I just start writing. And I do that because if I know, in my mind, if I set aside a certain time where I'm going to be writing, I can be thinking about what I'm going to be writing all week and then put it down on paper, right? My subconscious is just working on different concepts. I'm like, what do I want to write about? Well, I want to write about, the complexity of death or sex or, I'm sorry, not sex, I'm not married yet, or whatever else. And and then I put it down on paper. So all week, by being aware of what I'm writing about, I'm able to focus and focus and focus, and just by walking around going about my day and do all this work. Because then when Friday comes, I can write. Now, I said 2 things, I actually mean 3. So awareness, allowing your subconscious to really work on things you're interested in. 2, being intentional about rhythms, about where you're being. And then 3, it's what you're doing in those moments when you're writing, how you're creating those states. So, I am a huge proponent of immersive writing experiences, which means I think you're embodied. I think you are a whole person when your body and your soul and your mind, or whatever way you want to bifurcate yourself, are combined together, right? Because of this, my sense of taste, sense of smell, what I see, what I hear, what I feel on my body, they influence how I write. And so, as you write, I want you to consider how you can manipulate your scenery, your atmosphere, such that you can actually assist in the writing process. Here's what I mean. If I'm gonna write a nautical story, I promise you, this will happen. I have a nautical story in my head right now, and it will happen like this. When I write that story, I'm gonna go out to the store, I'm gonna buy a saltwater candle, I'm gonna get a really, really good bottle of the really peaty scotch. That just means like a really smoky and kind of like sea salty kind of tasting scotch. Scotch is alcohol, for those who don't know. And I'm going to play wave music, okay? So when I write, I'm gonna have wave music going on in the back of my head. I'm gonna have a saltwater candle right here, and I'm going to sip a little bit of scotch every time. I am now more embodied as I write, and I don't have to use my imagination to work as hard because I'm literally like surrounding myself with this, which allows me to think even more creatively about other things. When I write now, I mean, sometimes I don't even need to be that crazy. When I write now, I just find an album that's doesn't have any words on it. Typically for me, writing with words can be hard, though it depends on the album. An ambient album, and just listen to it on repeat. Most times, to be quite honest, I'll pick 1 song, maybe 2, and listen to them on repeat for about 4 hours. I know it might sound crazy, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep myself in the same state the entire time so I can focus on writing. And then later, when I edit, guess what I do? I put on that same music. I put myself in that same context, which makes it easier for me to re-enter into that flow state. The most enjoyable times of writing in my life have been moments where I put my pen to the paper, where I put my hands to the keyboard, and I look up and it's been 3 hours and it felt like a minute. And oh, by golly, there's a poem. And I hope you get that kind of joy out of your writing too. Now again, I'm not saying that you have to do anything that I said about like the process of writing itself. But I'm saying psychologists have shown that by creating these atmospheres, by setting criteria, and by the way, I'm only giving you a very, very small piece of Csikszentmihalyi's work as a whole, because I don't have time for everything else. But you can create these experiences to write. And it just makes things so enjoyable. Maybe this is not exactly what you need, but something to consider. If you're writing a story in the winter, don't have your heat on too much. Stand by a window, go walk outside. If you want to know what like let's say you're describing in a story like someone who burnt pancakes. You know what you need to go do? Go make some pancakes and burn them. If you overcook pancakes, you know what they taste like? They taste leathery. You want to know how I know that? Because I went and made them and I tried it. Like, you have the ability to be remarkably creative in just the situations you put yourself in. So if you're writing about nature, if you're writing about a specific place, if you're writing about this or that, go to that place, experience it. Keep yourself in that place as you write. It can be a lot of fun. They really do taste leathery too, like I promise. Like, it feels like you're just eating like cowhide. Anyways. As I close, I want to talk real briefly about editing And then I will get out of your hair and enjoy you guys to go survive the coronavirus crisis of 2019, 2020. When I began writing, I thought editing was for sissies. No. I'm just gonna do one try and it's gonna be fine and whatever. And it was arrogance that led me to believe that. I read an article by Donald Hall, who's a famous poet, who's the late famous poet named Donald Hall. And he writes about how, a poem's not really a poem until you edit it about 100 times. I think you guys may have read it for this class. I know for sure they read it in poetry class. And I was so bothered by it. I just really frustrated by that. It's really annoying because I don't think that's right, per se. But when he said that, what he did is he freed me to not be perfect on my first draft and to constantly work. And so what I used to do is I used to have just a one-word document, and I would type it, and I would come back later, and I would edit it, and I would come back later, and I would edit it again, and I would come back later and edit it again. It's all right now, whatever. Now what I do is I create an entire folder for a poem, for one poem. Here is The Summer in Alaska. And in that, I'll write draft 1. And when I finish draft 1, I'll duplicate it to put draft 2. And then I'll edit draft 2 the next time. And then I'll duplicate it when I'm done and do draft 3. And by doing this, I actually see how the poem progresses. And it's really, really helpful for me. And it allows me to really edit a lot. Now, even if I change a word or two, I'll make a new duplication because that's a new edit. And I was surprised to find that there's some poems I've edited 10, 15, 20 times before I even show anybody. I say all of that so that you don't feel the pressure to be perfect right away. And writing is rewriting in many ways. And it's great. It's a lot of fun. But I used to think that, in the initial moment of creativity, when I'm writing, it's just so wonderful, it's beautiful, it's great. And then editing is just drudgery to make sure the commas are where they're supposed to be. But when I took this method that was more experiential, more immersive, every moment was a creative moment. I got excited to go back and re-edit poems because they were exciting, because I was creating more. And so, as I close, I just want you to consider editing not as this drudgery that you have to do to make sure everything's perfect, but as another moment of creativity, as another moment that continues to bring you along. And I hope that you experience joy in that. Let me close with a poem by Christian Wyman named From a Window. Christian Wyman is a professor at Yale. He's my literary hero. It's been a huge honor that I actually was able to take a poetry writing class with him. And he was diagnosed with an incurable blood cancer about 10 years ago. He was only given a few years to live, if months, and he ended up surviving. But this poem he wrote right at the beginning of his diagnosis. And because I'm reading it out loud, I'm just going to tell you what the image is. The image is of a tree and birds in a tree rising from a tree. Sound good? All right, well, let me close you with this. From a window. Incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving, I saw a tree inside a tree rise kaleidoscopically, as if the leaves had livelier ghosts. I pressed my face as close to the pain as it could get to watch that fitful, fluid spirit rise, a single being undefined, or countless beings of one mind haul its strange cohesion beyond the limits of my vision, over the house, heavenwards. Of course I knew those leaves were birds. Of course that old tree stood exactly as it had and would, but why should it seem fuller now? That though man's mind might endow even a tree with some excess of life to which a man seems witness, that life is not the life of men. And that is where the joy came in. Friends, you have the ability to envision reality, to encounter some aspect of the divine in everything you do, even a measly tree. And I hope you understand that that life is not the life of men. And this instinct for creativity is a divine one. And I hope you experience transcendence as you do that. Grace and peace.